During the time of division in the kingdom of Israel, a series of wicked kings ruled in both the northern and southern kingdoms. This would also come as no surprise when the children of Israel became discontent with God as their king and sought an earthly ruler. God cautioned them that human kings would make them unhappy. The people of Israel persisted, and God gave them their desire. Many righteous kings in Judah ruled God's people, but the number of evil rulers who led the people into idolatry will indeed bring the nation to disrupt and captivity in a foreign land. King Pekah used to be a military commander in the army of King Pekahiah of Israel. The Assyrians had come to dominate the land during the reign of King Pekahiah. Many people in Israel did not want to be controlled by the Assyrians, especially members of Israel's military forces. Pekah eventually concluded that he had had enough of Pekahiah's authority and the Assyrians' control over him. As a result, he secretly planned to kill the king with 50 warriors from the nearby country of Gilead. In order to carry out this strategy covertly, Pekah had used the foreigners. In the end, Pekah slew Pekahiah in Samaria and proclaimed himself king. So he killed Pekahiah and became king in his place. King Pekah had a considerable impact on the nation of Israel as well as the entire world. Once Pekah assumed the throne, he perpetuated the paganism of Israel's previous kings. In the time of kings, there were wars between the kings of Israel and Judah because they were rivals. Judah's king at the time of Pekah's rule was Ahaz, and the two monarchs engaged in conflict. To overthrow the people of Judah, King Pekah teamed up with King Rezin of Aram. During Pekah's reign, another significant event occurred that gave God's people hope. When King Pekah and King Rezin of Aram moved against King Ahaz of Judah, the Lord sent the prophet Isaiah to Ahaz, Isaiah chapter 7, verse 7 through 9. For this is what the Lord God says, it shall not stand, nor shall it happen. The Lord also gave Ahaz a sign, and even though Ahaz declined because he did not want to put the Lord to the test, God moved Isaiah to present this well-known prophecy. Pekah felt that by following false gods and fighting the Assyrians with his own might, he could defeat Assyrian power. Despite ruling for a long 20 years, he was unable to expel the Assyrians from the region. Later in his rule, the Assyrians invaded a number of Israelite cities, and King Pekah failed to stop them since God had empowered the Assyrian king to carry out these actions. The Assyrians defeated the Israelites and marched a large number of captives back to their own country. The Assyrians annexed a large portion of northern Israel and deported its citizens into exile. Aram was divided into 5 Assyrian provinces and northern Israel into 3. With Assyria on its border and Pekah's anti-Assyrian stance, it was just a matter of time before someone who was pro-Assyrian acted and assassinated Pekah. This was the start of the collapse of the kingdom of Israel, which was God's punishment for the kings and their people's sins and idolatry. 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 7 through 23. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices that the kings of Israel had introduced. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did wicked things that aroused the Lord's anger. They worshipped idols, though the Lord had said, "You shall not do this." The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers. Turn from your evil ways, observe my commands and decrees, in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey, and that I delivered to you through my servants the prophets. But they would not listen and were as stiff-necked as their ancestors, who did not trust in the Lord their God. They rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their ancestors and the statutes he had warned them to keep. They followed worthless idols and themselves became worthless. They imitated the nations around them, although the Lord had ordered them, "Do not do as they do." They forsook all the commands of the Lord their God and made for themselves 2 idols cast in the shape of calves and an Asherah pole. They bowed down to all the starry hosts, and they worshipped Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. They practiced divination and sought omens and sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left, and even Judah did not keep the commands of the Lord their God. They followed the practices Israel had introduced. Therefore, the Lord rejected all the people of Israel. He afflicted them and gave them into the hands of plunderers until he thrust them from his presence. When he tore Israel away from the house of David, they made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, their king. Jeroboam enticed Israel away from following the Lord and caused them to commit a great sin. The Israelites persisted in all the sins of Jeroboam and did not turn away from them until the Lord removed them from his presence, as he had warned through all his servants the prophets. So the people of Israel were taken from their homeland into exile in Assyria, and they are still there. Hoshea, a military officer under King Pekah, grew tired of the regime, so he made the decision to depose the king. Ironically, Pekah had acquired his authority over Israel in a similar manner, and now he was experiencing the same thing. King Pekah believed he could govern the people of Israel far more effectively than the kings who came before him, but this was untrue. The monarch was eventually assassinated by Hoshea, who thereafter ascended to the throne. After Pekah's death, Hoshea reigned for 9 years, but King Shalmaneser of Assyria discovered Hoshea's betrayal in refusing to pay homage and attempting to ally with Egypt against Assyria, and imprisoned Hoshea. Shalmaneser would then conquer and expel the rest of Israel's people, completing God's judgment on the northern kingdom of Israel. God cautioned them that human kings would make them unhappy. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 6 through 18. But their demand displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge and rule over us." So Samuel prayed to the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have abandoned, rejected me, and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. So now listen to their voice. Only solemnly warn them and tell them the ways of the king who will reign over them." So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself to his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. He will appoint them for himself to be commanders over thousands and over 50s, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will take the best of your fields, your vineyards, and your olive groves, and give them to his servants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards, and give it to his officers and to his servants. He will take your male servants and your female servants, and your best young men and your donkeys, and use them for his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves shall be his servants. Then you will cry out on that day because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you on that day because you have rejected him as king." Idol worship in the family foundation leads to untold hardship, poverty, sickness, shame, reproach, insanity, untimely death, failure, and bondage. Exodus chapter 20, verse 2 through 5. New King James Version. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the 3rd and 4th generations of those who hate me." God despises idolatry completely. It brings God's wrath down on those involved. Idolatry brings curses upon the people and the land. Exodus chapter 20, verse 5. Idolatry provokes God to jealousy. It incites God's wrath. It defiles and pollutes people and the land. So, to answer the question, why are idols dangerous? Specifically, God's wrath is falling on idolatry. Nothing is more terrifying than the wrath of an all-powerful, all-righteous God, and, according to Paul, God's wrath is coming on idolatry. God's wrath falls on the idolater because God is jealous. There are two kinds of jealousy: righteous and holy jealousy, and unrighteous, weak, and insecure jealousy. And God's jealousy is not only justified, He deserves our most profound and strongest affections and admiration. God is envious that He is honored by being treasured, and envious that we are satisfied by treasuring Him. It's loving jealousy because we were designed to find our greatest joy when He's our greatest treasure. He is envious that He is honored by being treasured, and envious that we are pleased by adoring Him. As a result, He is jealous in a loving and righteous way. And if we find God to be so dull or insignificant that we must substitute other things that truly satisfy us more than He does, we not only offend Him, but we also destroy ourselves. What exactly is an idol, and how does it appear today? First and foremost, in the heart. Covetousness, which is idolatry, Paul says. Thus, idolatry today is the activity of the human heart. This is not a bodily act. Then there's a fruit on a branch. It all starts in the heart: craving, wanting, enjoying, and being satisfied by anything other than God. This is what Paul refers to as covetousness, a disordered love or desire, loving more than God what should be loved less than God, and only for God's sake. But this disordered heart is in a state of covetousness, which is an act of loving too much what should be loved less. This is how idolatry appears today. Idolatry begins in the heart: craving, wanting, enjoying, and being satisfied by anything more valuable than God. Finally, what exactly is an idol? That is the issue. It is the thing or person that was loved more than God, desired more than God, treasured more than God, and enjoyed more than God. It might be good grades. It could be other people's approval. It could be commercial success. It could be a hobby, a musical group, a sport, or your meticulously maintained yard. Your own appearance could be an idol. Anything could happen. So Paul puts it like this in Romans chapter 1, verse 25. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature, anything that is created, rather than the Creator. Jesus who delivers us from the wrath to come. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 9 through 10. New King James Version. For they themselves declare concerning us what manner of entry we had to you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God, and to wait for His Son from heaven, whom He raised from the dead, even Jesus who delivers us from the wrath to come. In closing, our question of the day: which female Bible character inspires you? Put your answers in the comment.